Well, welcome to Polity Matters, where we explore the importance of polity in the church. My name is Scott Edberg. I'm joined today with Jared Nelson and our special guest, a common guest, Steve Dowling. We are currently working through the rules of discipline in the PCA Book of Church Order, and we're near the end at BCO 46 on jurisdiction. And so this is the last chapter in our ROD. And so that means the next time we discuss the BCO, it will have to do with the directory, the infamous directory of worship. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We're on the rules of discipline. But before we get there, Steve, could you perhaps remind our listeners who you are and where you serve?
Yeah, I'm Steve Dowling. I'm a ruling elder in Southeast Alabama Presbytery. My immediate session service is at Covenant Presbyterian Church, where I've been for the last more than 20 years.
Well, as we get into the topic of jurisdiction, are there any preliminary thoughts you want to give to us, or any what are some things that would help prepare us for this chapter? It seems like kind of a boilerplate chapter, but is there any thoughts or preliminary ideas you have, Steve, on this issue?
Two of them. One, Jared had said previously that this chapter hasn't changed a lot, and it hasn't. It's been pretty static for a long time. You don't see a lot of overtures that are bent on changing chapter 46. So that's the first thing. It's been pretty static. It's been pretty stable. But the second thing is that it's funny how much business the SJC gets that actually relates to questions of this type of jurisdiction and transfer. And by that, I mean everything from the way that erasure from the roll functions to how transfers function and the duties that are associated with that. Because functionally speaking, somebody tells a session that they're leaving, a lot of these rules have become unenforceable. And when sessions try to act in good faith to meet their vows with respect to a member or even an officer leaving the church, they sometimes wind up in a judicial no man's land. So on the one hand, it's been very static, very stable. You can triangulate to it. On the other, it's actually used in a way that sort of obviates the taking of vows in the first place and creates an escape route for people who sometimes ought to be under discipline. So I think those two things are worth considering.
Yeah, when I was at RTS Jackson in a polity class with Guy Waters, Guy invited a ruling elder from FPC Jackson, and it was on this sort of issue. And he said, if a congregant renounces your jurisdiction, you just let them go. Otherwise, you have the potential of facing lawsuits, civil lawsuits for your actions if you constantly pursue them. And that gets back to preliminary principles, where this is a voluntary organization. And if we elect to leave, we leave. And obviously there are, issues of sin within that. But civilly speaking, we are a voluntary institution. And so jurisdiction is important. Well, getting into BCO 46.1 then, it says this: when a church member shall remove his residence beyond the bounds of the congregation of which he is a member, so that he can no longer regularly attend its services, it shall be his duty to transfer his membership by presenting a certificate of demission from the session of the church of which he is a member to the church which he wishes to unite. When the church of which he is a member has no session, or for other good reasons, it seems impossible for the member to secure a certificate of dismission, he may be received by the session upon other satisfactory testimonials, in which case the church of which he was a member shall be duly notified. And so perhaps a good introductory question as we think of the idea of jurisdiction is, what is church membership? What is church membership?
Well, I think we would think back to the vows that are taken, the responsibilities of the church member, but also the responsibilities of the church to have oversight over somebody. I was thinking about this today. I went to a hospital room where a woman in our congregation had suffered a stroke, and I was reading to her John 10, and just the fact that the sheep know the voice of the shepherd, and the shepherd knows the sheep by name and number. And we need to know who is in our care. And so both the elders, in a sense, take vows to have care over the sheep, and the sheep are taking vows to the church. And so this church membership is much more than just your name on the roll or
Hmm.
uh, bookkeeping type things. This is about the care of souls and in a group to know who your leaders are and who the leaders are responsible for.
Yeah. Would we
Would say that that's
perhaps? Oh, you're good.
a very fine answer. And yeah, Jared, my experience over the years has been that it's an interesting thing that both parties that you just mentioned take vows, which are vows uh, to God. I mean, those are promises to God. And yet, so many times when people transfer, we really don't assiduously follow up with them, stay in contact with them, love them. I can't tell you personally, to my shame, the last time I reached out to a geography where I knew members were moving and asked a session and linked up those two parties. And I think that in that, I'm not really meeting the requirements of the office. I'm not really meeting my vows, because that requirement is in there. And why is it in there? Well, it's like you said, for the care of the sheep. But I think more prominently, folks, when they leave, they do a lot of resorting out. I mean, there may be 5 PCA churches in a geography. There may be one. Maybe they go to an OPC church first. I mean, who knows what they do? One way or the other, though, that year-long clock winds up running out. So I think that very first part should serve as a great reminder of our mutual responsibility. And I think you're absolutely right to focus on the vows.
And when we're thinking of jurisdiction, membership is important. It's perhaps good to remind our listeners that our ruling elders are members of their local churches. That's where their jurisdiction resides, along with our congregants and the deacons. The pastors, the teaching elders of our churches, are actually members of the regional body, the presbytery, that's where their jurisdiction is most poignant. And we've talked about this before on our show, that it is not the duty of sessions to bring disciplinary actions against the pastor. That's the duty of the presbytery. And it's the work of the presbytery to do that. And so jurisdiction is important in both of those regards. But here we're looking at church membership. When thinking about church membership, uh, when this section talks about transferring to another church, is that talking about a PCA church? What kind of church is in mind in this section of the BCO?
We'd like to think it's PCA churches, but we actually accept other Bible-believing, credible churches within the body of Christ at large. So it is possible for someone to disaffiliate from the PCA and go to another church in good standing, in particular to a NAPARC church, as an example.
Yeah, I think of some transfers we've had to Baptist churches, and it's always kind of funny because you're trying to complete a formal process that they often don't recognize. And so you're like, I'm trying to dismiss them to you. Are they members now? And they're like, what's membership? And so it's sometimes difficult to transfer people outside of the PCA if they have different standards for membership in general.
Point,
Well, perhaps what are
Yeah,
yeah, go ahead, Jared.
oh, I was wondering about that second paragraph, which you're probably going to ask about, of like, what are those situations in which it seems impossible? You have 2 PCA churches, or somebody's coming from a PCA church or a church that should be diligent on that, and for good reasons, either it has no session or it seems impossible for the member to secure a certificate. Like, I wonder what those situations would be, other than maybe the church doesn't exist anymore. Like if it just folded and don't know who to contact. I don't know if you guys have seen that in your time where it's impossible or just nobody responds. I don't know.
2 weeks ago, actually, got a call from a pastor here in Southeast Alabama, a wonderful guy who's very, very detail oriented and didn't want to wind up sideways on the BCO. So he called me about that. And that was literally the situation, Jared. The church had shut down. There was no one to transfer them. And I said, brother, the most expedient thing to do here with this couple that's desirous of being, under the authority of shepherds and a church that's willing to receive them like you are, you bring them into the session, you hear their testimony, and you transfer them in by profession of faith, and that's what they wound up doing. But That's the only kind of situation I've seen where that's happened, Jared, is where the church doesn't exist anymore, because by and large, folks will communicate out of any church.
Yeah, we live near an Air Force base, and so we have a lot of transfers in through the Air Force base, but sometimes their membership is outside of the United States, and you look up the church website and there's not really any contact information, and they don't have contact, and just getting a hold of people is extraordinarily difficult. And so I've seen that there's been a few cases at my current call where we just have no way of reaching people outside of the US because there's just not good contact methods. So we take them by profession, we hear their profession and have an irregular transfer in. Any other thoughts on 46.1? All right, 46.2. It's a lengthy one. BCO 46.2 says, when a church member shall remove his residence beyond the bounds of the church of which he is a member into the bounds of another, it shall be the duty of the teaching and ruling elders of the church of which he is a member, as far as possible, to continue pastoral oversight over him and to inform him that according to the teaching of our book of church order, it's his duty to transfer his membership as soon as practicably practicable to the church in whose bounds he is living. It shall also be the duty of the church from whose bounds the member moved to notify the teaching and ruling elders of a church into whose bound he has moved and request them to take pastoral oversight of the member, with a view of having him transfer his membership unless BCO 18.7 applies. If a member, after having thus been advised, shall neglect for 1 year to have his membership transferred, the session shall then proceed according to BCO 38.4, except in special cases such as servicemen, students, etc. The name of any members whose residence has been unknown for 1 year to the session shall be removed from the roll, and such names are not to be counted in the annual statistics reports, though an act of removal should be recorded in the session's minutes. If such a person at a later date should appear or desire transfer of his or her letter, the session will inform the governing body of the inquiring church of their action in removing the person from their roll. And so in this section, we have both responsibilities for the individual, the congregant, as well as the session. What's the responsibility of the individual, or perhaps even the family?
Well, they should be looking for a church. Now, the church that they're coming from also should be helping them in that, but it really is the responsibility of that family to be looking for a good church that they can attend to there. And uh, if I was knowing the BCO, which your average layperson is not going to know very well, I would inquire with the church if they've contacted the old church. Um, so knowing what I do now, I would probably contact my old church to let them know, what the process is and who's going to be contacting them in case the other church doesn't do their due diligence. But um, hopefully they're getting a contact from their old church where they're asking them those sorts of questions too.
And perhaps we can dive a little deeper in what the session's role is. I know, Steve, you said that this is probably the hard part that we often fall short of, but what is our responsibility as shepherds in the church to those who move away?
It's pretty explicit that we're supposed to follow up with them and treat them as though they're still under our care until they're actively under the care of another session. It's just functionally, I don't think that's usually the case. And one of the reasons I think that is because what we're reading here in the BCO sort of assumes a wonderful relationship, where everyone is engaged, the members engaged in the work and worship of the church. Everybody loves one another. It's kind of a wonderful church situation. Mm-hmm. And then they move, and everybody mutually is working toward the same goal of coming into another PCA church, being put under care, and making introductions, maybe even creating some sense of continuity in their shepherding, and therefore in their spiritual growth. But practically speaking, what really happens lots of times is people leave and there was something they didn't like. Maybe they didn't like the form of the church government. Maybe they liked the preaching, but they objected to some theological aspect. Here in Southeast Alabama, we have a very powerful root sunk into the Baptist church, right? And so as a consequence, we picked up a lot of people who, when they leave us, they wind up going, if they transfer, they may go back to a Baptist church. They may go back to, an OPC church because, we're a college town and the music's too contemporary or whatever. And they haven't, in some cases, been really desirous of a lot of rudder and a lot of attention, after they've left, except insofar as you've got a personal relationship and you're just calling a friend. So, I think on the one hand, when everything's great, this is a very natural motion to follow. When everything isn't great, or there's been some fractiousness with the member or the member's family or something like that, then you kind of have this disconnect. And I think that that's the part that needs the most attention. You have to love folks even when they're not being loving. And you do that without insistence and without trying to dominate them, harangue them, or anything else. And that's where it really becomes hard, because you want the best for them. I mean, if you don't, then you shouldn't be an elder.
One great story from one of my mentors, Charlie Wingard, when I was serving under him in Yazoo City, he would make it a point to travel to each of the state universities every semester and have dinner with the students that were from our church in that location. And so he would go to Ole Miss and Mississippi State once a semester and catch up with some of the students that were members of our church, just to care for them and to visit them. And I just remember the families and the students themselves. I mean, who travels, 2, 3 hours to go visit me? My family doesn't even do that often unless there's a game. And so it left an impression on me. I don't do it as well as Charlie does, but that I think is the ideal. That's how you practically offer oversight to those who are far from you, and they don't mean to stay far. They're just at school. But that was always so beautiful, seeing the photos of him with those students and the devotion he's had to them.
I'm not surprised to hear that about Charlie. He's wonderful.
He is a wonderful man. It's hard to live in his shadow, even as a minister. What about the limitations here? We do have some limitations. If a member, after being thus advised, shall neglect for 1 year being transferred, then the session shall proceed to 38-4. Why is there a 1 year limit? Is that just arbitrary? We've kind of talked about arbitrary time frames in the BCO before. Why do we have a year here?
I think you put your finger on it. I mean, it could be 6 months, could be 9 months, could be 364 days instead of 365. It's consistent with other timelines in the BCO, but I have no idea whether there's some sort of a deeper component to it. And Jared, I'd defer to you. What do you know?
I think it's arbitrary, just to have some sort of a trigger that gets everybody on the same page. Because if you were just to ask people how long, if one person says 6 months, another person says 9 months, then you're just going to be fighting over the time limit. This actually triggers, okay, guys, it's been a year. We're now having to trigger this thing. Same thing with somebody that's neglected being in the church. Like, how long do you give them? And everybody has a different number. Well, if you have a number that's set out there for action to be triggered, you actually start to do it. So I think that's what it is. I do think it's interesting. It has some special cases. There are some times that this can't be triggered. Servicemen, students. You have somebody in the Navy that's out on a boat, and they're away, or they're in a foreign country and they can't be a member of the church there. That's different. We had a member in our church that would go down for months at a time to a place in Central America, where he told us, if he ever actually moved there, he would not want to transfer membership anywhere because his only choices were Mormon churches and Catholic churches. So there's nothing else that was around other than that. So he would listen to us online on Sundays and come back to us when he was back. But just thought of, like, if he ever moved there, there's nowhere to transfer him to. So.
You
I think
again have put your finger on. I'm sorry, please go ahead, brother.
I think a good policy here is that you're not making an example with anyone with what you're doing. Sometimes in on church sessions, you have a situation where you don't have a policy in place, but you wish you did, because now you have to make an action that you have no prior precedent for making. And so I think something like this is helpful in saying this is what our book says, and we're following the book. It's not a personal act of vendetta against you. This is the law that we've been given, and this is if we want it to be different, we have to go through processes to change it. But it makes it less of a personal act, and it takes out the personalities from making such a decision. There might be there, that sometimes is the case in the church. But in these circumstances, you're not making an example of someone where you want to get them off the rolls and you're just doing it because you want to do it. Well, no, this is gives you the process for how and why. Did you have something, Steve?
I've got three things actually. The first one is that 38.4 is disciplinary. It's administrative discipline, but it's disciplinary. So what you don't have is the process where where you don't have a situation where you undertake process and charge a person or anything like that. But functionally, you're removing their name from the roll. And I think 38.4, which I don't have up in front of me, but I'm pretty sure the language is that it's an act of pastoral discipline. And it needs to be considered to be an act of pastoral discipline. It means that in taking these vows that we spoke about earlier, you haven't really taken seriously your duty to the church writ large, or you'd be in one. And we would be able to transfer you, and we would know that you didn't come out from under shepherding care. We would know that you're serious about your own life and that of your family. So I think that it's important for people to realize that end date is as objective as you said it was, but it's also punitive in a way. It's pastoral discipline. It's telling you you're not doing it right. The second thing is this exclusion of special cases. I think that's ultra important because it leaves the discretion for how to deal with people who are in the kinds of situations that Jared spoke about with the session to say, no, that makes sense. And we're going to retain that membership. This person wants to be bound to a church. It wants to be affiliated with one. It doesn't want to be out from under the kind of cover you get for shepherding. And, and we get to make those decisions because it's at our discretion to do it. And then the third thing is that the most important word here is probably et cetera, because that really and truly does root the discretion to make a decision about any individual in the session. And we all know there are myriad circumstances that could cause people to not move for a year. We've got a minister right now who's shutting down our Korean church that meets in our building. He's got cancer. And he's going to, my understanding is he's going to Durham, North Carolina, where his son's an oncology surgeon. I believe I'm getting that right. If not, he's going there because he's a surgeon of some type and he has an oncology practice that he can tap into. But one way or the other, when someone goes off on something like that, you don't know what the rehabilitation period is. You don't know whether the intent is that they were going to repatriate in 9 months. And, so to go ahead and exert 38.4, when they cross over a year, when their whole intent was to be back after they went through their period of treatment or something, is ridiculous. You need to have the ability as a session to say, we will deal with that in the due course of time and let those things play out. So I think et cetera here is a really big word because it reaffirms the discretion of the session to focus on what's best for the member, what's best for the individual. So I just wanted to throw those things in there. Not sure how helpful they were, but that's my thinking on it.
Yeah, that's a good example. It's very common for us even to have church members who go on hospice or are sick, and that leads them to all sorts of interesting areas in the world, sometimes for surgeries and rehab. And so this allows for the latitude of not being needlessly burdensome upon those who are already ailing by trying to remove them quickly. We've talked about it even at Providence. I've not seen one of our members in a long time in church because he has a health issue. And the question was, how long do we keep him on the rolls? And it's like, well, indefinitely. He's sick. He needs us, and we need to serve
Right.
him
Yeah.
as we can. BCO 46.3, we got to keep moving here. Members of the church dismissed to join another shall be held to be under the jurisdiction of the session, dismissing them until they form a regular connection with that to which they have been dismissed. What is this teaching us about the transition process from one church to another for a member?
Um, I'll wade in. Obviously, the first there's a couple components here, right? One is that the people have to have joined. The person has to have joined a church where they're going to, in their destination, and then there's this administrative transaction of having released them. And so, my view of it would be that this is concomitant to tying off uh, an ordination or a particularization ceremony where you go through it and then it's finalized when you date and sign all the documentation. I can see that that'd be a point of dissension if anybody ever disputed it. You can say, well, we've been going to church here. We went here long enough to decide to join it. We took our vows. We were accepted as members. We stood in front of the room. And, we think they've got jurisdiction over us. But I do think it needs to be tied off with the documentation that we're required to produce as well. Just as a matter of information, I would absolutely agree that that other church had jurisdiction for what that's worth.
Yeah, I like Smith's comments, which are only like two sentences. He says, "This simply guarantees that the individual does not lose his membership in the church visible. If for some reason he fails to join another church or is not received by another church, he remains a member of his original church until received elsewhere." So this is you didn't fall through the crack in the paperwork. If the church has something happen and you're not received that Sunday, you're still a member of the church. You're still on the rolls.
Perhaps in likewise manner and building off of that between church relations is associate members. And we see that in BCO 46:4. Associate members are those believers temporarily residing in a location other than their permanent homes. Such believers may become associate members of a particular church without ceasing to be communicant members of their home churches. An associate member shall have all the rights and privileges of that church, with the exception of voting in a congregational or corporate meeting, and hold an office in that church. And so in this section, there is a provision for being an associate member. That is a member of two churches, one being the associate and one being the original home church. And at the associate church, you have all the full rights and privileges of being a member of that church, minus two perhaps notable issues, and that is in voting in congregational meetings and holding office in that church. I believe associate membership is somewhat unique in the PCA. Why does it exist?
Probably for some of those categories that we're talking about earlier, students and servicemen, people that are in a place temporarily but are going back. Maybe they're there for a treatment for a season. They want to be an associate member to be recognized by the rest of the church. It is interesting when you think about the rights and privileges. What are the rights and privileges of a member if they can't vote and they can't be an officer? Well, those include being cared for and shepherded. So there's a sense in which it's a alerting of a church. Look, you have somebody that may not officially be on your rolls, but you're responsible for them, and they have privileges of being shepherded, of you including them in a shepherding group, of you including them on your church email, whenever you're going to have a picnic or whatever it may be, that they're included with those sorts of things. So it's again, another provision that we recognize in a modern world. People travel around, and there are especially a couple groups that this is a common thing. If you ever have service people in your congregation, you will have to deal with having associate members. I find it a little bit funny too. Whenever we have people come into our presbytery, Jay Nykirk will always ask them questions in the BCO exam about associate membership, and there'll be technical questions that you have no idea what the answer is to. And then at the end of it, he just says, "Well, I'm just wondering because I don't know exactly how it works in all the details either." So there's a lot of questions I think this doesn't answer, but it does provide for some sort of provision to care for people.
I think it's got a lot of wisdom to it. First because I spent almost 3 decades in the military, and there are places that you go, especially on extended deployments or unaccompanied tours overseas, where you've got the chapel and that's it. And you can't first transfer membership into a chapel, and second, the way that the chaplaincy works, Protestant pastors are all considered the same thing, and they conduct the services. So you really don't even have continuity in your basic theology at a chapel. So from a military standpoint, like Jared pointed out, I've always been a fan of this provision. But now I live in a college town, and I can tell you that we get a lot of people who really want to only be associate members. Well, why? Well, because the Auburn's 90 minutes from Birmingham, and it's 60 minutes from Montgomery, and there's a lot of downtime. You start school, then you've got fall break, then you've got the holidays for Christmas, then you've got Christmas and New Year's, and then you've got spring break. And the reality is that these folks are back at their home churches a pretty substantial amount of time. They don't really break that connection. So at least in the local collegiate environment that I'm operating in, this is a wonderful provision to have. It enables them to to have the relationship with us and participate while they're in school, and then to go home and be plugged right into their home church in the same way.
Well, moving on then, BCO 46.5 is vacated. It seems like it was merged into another section. It's just the prior BCO 46.5 was dealing with removing someone after a year. And so we've already kind of talked about that in other sections of 46.5, and that was done all the way back, I believe, in the 90s, 1997. And so we'll go on to 46.6, which is when a presbytery shall dismiss a minister, licentiate, or candidate, the name of the presbytery to which he is dismissed shall be given in the certificate, and he shall remain under the jurisdiction of the presbytery dismissing him until received by the other. And so this is dealing more broadly with those who are ordained and under the jurisdiction of the presbytery itself, but also those who are under both the jurisdiction of the presbytery in some regard with licentiates and candidates, as well as the local church. And so this is a similar provision that we just read in 46-3, except it's dealing with those who have relations with a presbytery itself. Is there anything to note here, guys?
I think it's just something of you may have a presbytery that is going to dismiss somebody to another presbytery, and if that presbytery has problems and doesn't receive them, it doesn't mean that. I think it clarifies a little bit. If you're the presbytery and you're voting, no, we don't recognize that as a call to the place that you're going. You're not putting them under discipline. You're not. They're not losing their credentialing. They still have that held at the previous presbytery, but you need to be able to make decisions as a receiving presbytery that the other one isn't forcing your hand. So this just clarifies, if you say no, they're still a member of the other presbytery, and figure out what comes next after that.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth saying that, in the case of these categories of men, they've been put into that classification or that status by a presbytery action. They've been examined, and the presbytery will have received testimony about a man's internal call to the gospel ministry and things like that. And those elevate consideration of jurisdiction and our responsibility as a church generally to further that continuum if it becomes necessary for a man to move. So I'd say it's a little bit of a different requirement set that's being addressed here. And so a little bit of extra care on addressing it specifically.
Yeah, there's a lot of details in here too, right? When you're a licentiate or a candidate, transferring includes usually transferring with something. And so often candidates will transfer from one presbytery to another. They've completed their internship in seminary, and so the receiving presbytery will also receive that internship completion mark. And ministers, they don't retake all the exams. They just do transfer exams. And so there's a lot that goes with transfer. It's kind of like a chicken and egg, though, because the presbyteries don't usually shake hands at the same time. Often the receiving presbytery receives the man before he's officially transferred by the other presbytery. And so there's like always a mismatch in who's shaking whose hand when. And so you're kind of stuck in like at least intellectually in limbo until your sending presbytery officially signs off on you leaving. Though some presbyteries have commissions that do this very thing, and it's really tight, but not all presbyteries. Moving on to 46.7, no certificate of dismission from either a session or a presbytery shall be valid testimony of good standing for a period longer than 1 year, unless its earlier presentation be hindered by some providential cause, and such certificates given to persons who have left the bounds of the session or presbytery granting them shall certify the standing of such persons only at the time of their leaving those bounds. And so, what does BCO 46.7 seek to clarify for us?
Maybe if you're a receiving presbytery, that you shouldn't wait too long to actually receive that person, or you're gonna have to go back and ask again. So to put some sort of a time limit on it, but also make it reasonable. You may have a presbytery that only meets a couple times a year, and so you want to give enough time for them to receive it, and a year should be enough time.
Hmm. And a lot changes in a man's life, even in the time of 1 year. And so if if you're taking a testimony from a presbytery from a man that they've not seen in 3 years and do not know, a lot can change in a man's life in that 3 years. And so you need up-to-date information. It's even when you're thinking through references at churches or in normal jobs, you want to know the people closest to the man now, not the people he knew 10 years ago. Those might be helpful for character checks, but you want to know how he's currently doing in his work capacity, not what he was 5 years ago when he was an intern. And so it's helpful to have up-to-date information. And that's all that requires here is that you get a new, renewed, up-to-date reference check on the man. Any other comments on 46.7? I want to be conscientious of time here. 46.8. When a presbytery shall divest a minister of his office without censure or depose him without excommunication, it shall assign him to membership in some particular church, subject to the approval of the session of that church. Perhaps we can start by distinguishing what is the difference between divestiture and deposition. We have a SJC man on today, and so what is the distinction between those two acts?
Well, you can be divested without judicial process. You can also accept someone demitting their office for reasons that range from not feeling called to the gospel ministry anymore to let your imagination fly. So one of those, I would just say, admits of the possibility of a non-judicial procedure for someone no longer being ordained. And the second one, the deposition, is definitely a judicial action, only it has not, in this case that's cited here, resulted in excommunication. So if the man isn't cut off completely from the body of Christ, he is no longer, because he's no longer a teaching elder, under the authority of presbytery, so he must be assigned to a session. There's been an awful lot of trouble with this. In fact, there are 3 overtures that were approved last year at the General Assembly that all bear on this problem, and they have necessitated some amendments to BCO 36, really chapters 4, 5, and 8. Mm-hmm. And what it does is it on the one hand prevents presbytery from having to undertake entirely new process to elevate an indefinite kind of suspension for a man, or in this case that we've got explicitly here in 48.6, the idea that you've deposed him without excommunication. Mm-hmm. Who has the power to excommunicate? You'd think it would be this church to which he's been assigned, but in practicality, the presbytery has retained authority over those judicial cases. So they've elevated the censure, sometimes without process, sometimes with whole new trials and so on. And so that flurry of things that we saw this year at the General Assembly all bear on this fundamental issue and seek to bring both clarity and administrative simplicity to the process, while at the same time preserving the rights of the individual who's under censure in a way that they previously hadn't been protected. But that's a long conversation. You'll have to go reswizzle and have a session on on all those changes to the BCO, which you'll probably do anyway, right? After they get approved or disapproved.
Yeah, we've talked about those amendments a little bit on the show. That was an issue. That Jared's smile that no one can see except us three is because that's my presbytery's fault that all those overtures came in because we tried to elevate a censure without additional process, and that has led to maybe we need to clarify. And that was it was an interesting case because we had tried to use SJC precedent to hit a home run and to have it upheld. But the SJC decided that the prior SJC erred in its decision, and that's probably what has led to the amendments to the book, because prior SJCs are disagreeing with current SJCs, and that means there's probably some ambiguity that needs further clarification. And so I'm grateful for those amendments personally, and it will help us not make those mistakes again if ratified. But
I'm with you. I mean, I think you guys did the church a service because the SJC truly is divided. I'm of the mind that if you depose somebody and sent them off, put them under the authority of the session, in the same way that we just got done talking about how you take a licentiate or a candidate and move them to a different presbytery or whatever, that the jurisdiction question is taken up at that point, and that you can't have mutual jurisdiction. And so the idea that someone could reach back and say, well, we're tired of waiting for that guy to repent, so we're just going to declare him contumacious, and now he's excommunicated, when he may have been faithfully going to church for 2 years at this new place. We don't know. And yet, if you do an entirely new trial, it's exhausting. I mean, there are all kinds of requirements. There's all kinds of cost with having to record everything and all the rest of it. And so I think that what you guys precipitated was a really, really good conversation that landed us in a place where we do a better job now, if these get approved, of protecting the rights of the individual, and at the same time, don't put an undue burden on presbytery in the dispensation of justice. So I think it was well done on y'all's part, because we wouldn't have had that conversation without it.
I'm glad our errors could lead to greater purity in the church.
Is he being sarcastic? I can never tell.
You never know with me. It is helpful, though, as we're thinking through divestiture, demitting, and deposition. It seems that divestiture is an act of the court upon the man for all sorts of reasons of not having a call, etc. Demitting is the act of the man himself requesting to have his credentials removed, and neither of those are caused by process in the church, no church court process, no trials. And then deposition is connected to trials themselves. And so there's two ways to be removed from office without censure or trial, and that's through yourself demitting or the court divesting you. And then one way for the court to force you out, through trial and et cetera. And so there's those perhaps are helpful clarifications, because those terms all get thrown around sometimes interchangeably, but they have perhaps different contexts. Any other comments or thoughts perhaps on this chapter as we close up? Well, hearing none, thanks for joining us today, Steve. It's always a joy to have you on. It's been really helpful. I think this is a very helpful chapter in the ROD, and it helps us not cross swords unnecessarily. If you enjoyed this episode today, we encourage that you support us, follow us on our various social media accounts. Perhaps share this episode with a friend that might find it helpful, or you can perhaps buy us a coffee, and that'll be in the link, and that helps keep everything running, keeps the lights on for us. As our BCO experts everywhere will say, this podcast is over. Please say goodbye, gentlemen.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.